I'm from a little far away. I'm from Guatemala, and yeah, that's that small spot on the left-hand side of the picture. That's my country. Really small country. I love the weather over there. It's almost like spring the whole year, and we're not known for tech, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to change. I usually introduce myself as Adrian, as it's easier for an English speaker to say, but I was just chatting with someone a little bit earlier that it's interesting that here in Poland, I have found out that easier to say my name as in Spanish, Adrian. So that's my name, that's my Twitter handle. You can find me tweeting about several things, mostly about tech and about soccer. I really like soccer. I'm on Team Android. And yeah, these logos represent a little bit of what I do. I'm very community oriented. I co-organize several of the local groups. I mentioned a small country, so I organize the GDG, that's the Google Developer Group. Here's an Android with like a Mayan skin and like trying to represent a little bit of our culture at Guatemala. I also organize the JavaScript community and also the Nodebots community. This is JavaScript for robotics. It's quite nice. And also, well, Elemental Geeks used to be a really big part of my professional life, but running a startup, it's exhausting. So I've been lately, for a couple of months, been away from that. Now I'm focusing on Galileo. I lead a lab over Galileo. It's called the Innovation Lab. Formally, I'm the director of the Innovation Lab, but I like to think that my position over there is like a mad scientist because I like to build a lot of crazy experiments. We've been working with 3D printing, IoT, wearables, and also with engineering education. That means that I'm trying to get more people into engineering degrees. And for a couple of years, I've been a GDE. That's a Google Developer Expert. I don't think myself as an expert, but I like the title. It's like an endorsement. I don't work for Google, but I work closely with them, with the developer relations team at Latin America. And I'm a GDE on Android, on Firebase, and on IoT. That mainly describes my main interests. I like a lot of working with hardware. I'm a software developer, but I think hardware gives you like a more a good representation of your ideas in the real world. So that's my email. That's me working on a 3D printed telepresence robot. That's unassembled, but it works, I swear. A lot of our experiments end up failing, but that's really fun. That's a really fun thing about the job. I get to experiment a lot. I get to fail a lot, and it might sound like counterintuitive at first, but I like failing because in failing you learn a lot. Okay, so we're gonna have a lot of raise your hand polls. That's supposed to be an emoji over there, but I think it's missing. Yeah, I don't know why, but I'm gonna ask you to raise your hand a couple of times during the conference. Okay, first question: how many of you are already Android developers? Raise your hands. Awesome. How many of you are iOS developers? Okay, a couple of people. How many of you consider yourself like, I don't like the title that much, but I think a lot of us understand, senior developers? Raise your hands. Okay, like half of the audience. I assume the other half consider yourself like in a midpoint before getting to the senior level. Is anyone looking forward to learn Android? Raise your hand. Oh, yeah, a lot of people. Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna keep asking questions during the talk. It's a little bit difficult to introduce yourself without talking about what do you do for work, for your the professional part of your life, I mean. But I think what you work on changes a lot. So I like to introduce myself as a learner and as a storyteller. So I'm gonna tell you a story. That's me with a friend. Many of you, I assume, know this friend. It's Andy. That's us last summer. We have been friends for a couple of years, around 5 or 6, I think. I have known Andy for like 6 years in 2009. And Andy is a really good friend. When we began our friendship, things were a little bit without an order. I mean, that's a little bit of Android code, but on the left-hand side, you can see that there are a lot of files, there's a lot of chaos, and there's not a structure at all. Well, this is using Android Studio, but before that, there was Eclipse, and I even try an experiment for a while. I work with Emacs, using like an iPad to code, connecting remotely to another computer to build, and it was crazy, but it was an experiment, so yeah. Okay, so this is like the beginning of our friendship, Andy and I mean. So knowing that there's like this whole unstructured way of working, I thought that we should have a talk with Andy. He didn't like it that much, but I was able to introduce some order. This is I'm not sure it's the same app, but you can see on the left-hand side that now that we have packages. There's a package for adapters, another one for data, with one sub-package for models, another one for fragments, another one for helpers, and there's a main activity. So this looks better than the first approach. At least we have some order. But still, there's not this is not an architecture approach to solve the issue of developing an Android app. Having a lot of appreciation for Andy and knowing how we used to do things, I wonder how can we get this in a better way? Usually when you are developing an Android app, there's like a common workflow. I guess like as we got a lot of raised hands, a lot of you know that we have activities and fragments. Usually these are for UI tasks. I think that's common. Sometimes there are also for UI logic. That's a little bit weird. And even you can find database queries on activities and fragments. And that's completely wrong. So that's why we need an architecture. That's why we need to change our approach to developing apps. So Andy has been present at a variety of important moments in my life. That's me trying Google Glass for the first time. It was awesome. Sadly, the product didn't work that good. Hopefully, eventually, we'll get a replacement. But anyway, I have a wonder, why should we have an architecture? It may seem like a complication at first, but eventually, this will allow us to have a better application, a better cycle of application development. At the end of the day, software it's for people. So we should have some approach to get this easy for people to read. Here are a couple of ideas on why should we bother on learning architecture. The first one is maintainability. Because I'm coding this today, but eventually there will be more developers involved. There will be maybe different developers that the ones that are my peers right now. And eventually the app can scale. A lot of things can happen. But usually we think in terms of, I don't know, that our development is gonna be good for a couple of years, maybe even more than that. So having a mindset of maintainability since the beginning will help to get a plan on how the app that we're developing today will be good for the next 2, 3, 5, or even 10 years. Having an architecture since the beginning will allow us to get there, to reach maintainability easily. Also, related, it's scalability. We might be developing something for a small startup, but we don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe after a month, we get a couple of thousand users, and we need to rewrite some of the code. This is common. I guess a lot of you have faced this issue on how do you handle the scalability of an app. Having an architecture approach to the development of an app helps you to do this easily. Also, testability. There's a typo in there, sorry. It's getting more common to write tests, and that's great. It's still difficult or somewhat difficult to do test-driven development on mobile, mostly because the tools are not quite there yet, but it's a work in progress. Anyway, it's really important to test your apps. So another question, how many of you are writing unit testing for your apps? Awesome, almost all of the audience. How many of you are writing instrumentation testing for your apps? Like maybe 1/3 of the hands that were raised before. And how many of you are writing integration testing? Like 4 or 5 hands. Testing is really important, but it's a long path to walk. Unit testing is a great start, but eventually, when we are writing our test, we're gonna face some issues that, if it's our first approach, it's not easy to write tests. Many of you maybe have faced this problem that sometimes when we are beginners at writing tests, it's not that easy. Architecture helps you in writing tests in a better way. And also, we're writing software for long-term reliability. Our software, our apps are expected to work in whatever they are intended to do. It doesn't matter if it's a social app, if it's a productivity app. The user is expecting for the app to work, to be reliable, to focus on the activity, not on the app itself. I mean, when I work on these slides, I was thinking on, hey, I should add an image, a title. I wasn't thinking on, this is Google Drive. Google Drive slides work in this way. So at the end of the day, our apps empower the users to focus on the activity, whatever that is. And our apps should be reliable. Also, it's important to decouple. A lot of times, the way the apps grow, the software grows, it's not in order. So having modules or code essentially that's coupled, one module with another, will prevent us from scale and will prevent us to speed up the process of developing the app. So decoupling is another important thing. And as I mentioned, software is about people. I don't know why, but as developers, we usually forget this. And what I would like for everyone to have in mind is that I'm writing software for my peers to read and understand, not for the machine or whatever it's executing the software. I'm, as a human, writing software for other humans. I'm writing software for other people to use it, to take advantage of it, and for other people to keep developing on that. And it's really important to have this in mind, because when we forget about this basic principle, we start to writing code that might be really fast, but not as understandable. One example that I usually use with this, it's reflection. I used to be a big fan on Java Reflection. One of our first apps at Elemental Geeks use a connection to a backend. I'm talking about 2010, 2011. That's about 5 years ago. At the time, there wasn't as many good libraries as we have now. Now we have Retrofit, Bolly, Jackson, JSON, and a lot of incredible good libraries. Well, at that time, I wrote a sort of parser for the connection to the API, but I use reflection, and it worked great because when someone changed the backend and added a new field, I didn't have to change the mobile app. But when I handed that to a different developer, he had a really hard time understanding. And that's when I noticed that I was writing code for it to be efficient, to be fast, but I wasn't writing code for another human being. And that, I don't know, that I think that's simply against the basic principles of software development. Okay, so before mobile, I used to work a lot of Ruby on Rails. So I was familiar with the MVC pattern. iOS hardly encourages you to use MVC. Android doesn't have like this. So I work on several experiments using the activity as a controller, using the XML as the view. The model was a different class, but it didn't quite feel like right, or it didn't felt like it was the right approach. Anyone that it's not familiar with MVC, raise your hand. Awesome. So we have the model, the controller, the view. The user interacts with the view, eventually gets to a controller that manipulates the model and all the way back. With MVP, we have a small modification from MVC. Has anyone worked with MVP in any platform? A lot of you. Has anyone worked with MVP with mobile? A lot of you also. That's awesome. Okay, we have the model, the presenter, and the view. It's similar to MVC, but the main difference is that here we're focusing on the presentation or how the user interacts with the app. So a couple of things to have in mind here. The view, the presenter, and the model will have a contract or an interface that describes the basic behavior. Also, the view will be the activity. The presenter should be a Java class with with no tie to the Android framework, and the model should be in a similar way. The model is more open to debate, as usually it includes some of the business logic. So that business logic might be tied to the Android framework, but at least the presenter should be independent of that. The view shows the interface, the presenter obtains data from the model, and the model handles the business logic. It's not that different from MVC. What I found quite difficult was, how do I take this, the theoretical approach, and implement that on Android? So here's a simple example for that. It's a login. The code is published on my GitHub. I'm gonna walk a little bit through the specifics. On the left-hand side, I have two modules. It's grouped by feature. I think that's one of the best approach to have. Instead of grouping by what the class is doing, I think it's better to group by feature. So I have two features. The first one is content. It's gonna show a list eventually. And on the lower part, we have the login. On the right-hand side, it's like Zoom. And we have one class for each part of the architecture. So we have the presenter, the view, and the model. There are two classes because one is the contract, an interface that I mentioned. The other one is the implementation. And also, we have events. We're gonna discuss event bus in a bit. And there's a folder that's not that's collapsed DI. That's for dependency injection. We're not gonna discuss dependency injection in this talk, but it's something that you should might peek into it at least. How many of you are using dependency injection? Raise your hand. Well, everyone is using it. Awesome. Okay, so that's our structure for the project. That's a quick demo on how does it works. It's a login with two fields. Actually, I have to mock the feature, I have a random number. So when it's an odd number, it would show an error. And when it's the other way around, it will take you to the screen. And it will show you a list of different things. On the app bar, there are 3 icons. With each one, you can choose different kind of elements to be shown. Okay, so the view, we have a couple of things here. There are methods to enable and disable inputs, to show and hide the progress bar, and to do some actions when the login works or when it fails. It's really simple because what I'm trying to show here, it's like a canonical approach to architecture. So I only have 2 methods, one for success and one for a failed login. And the one that fails shows an error. I'm not sure if you can see it on the text field, but when it fails, shows a small icon using the new text input layout from material design. Okay, how do we implement this? An important thing to have in mind here is that the view should be passive. I mean, all the logic should be on the presenter. So I don't have any conditionals here. I don't have an if or a while or a loop. There's the enable and disable inputs on the left. The method set inputs only change the visibility to visible or gone. Something similar with the progress bar that shows that change the visibility from visible to gone. Here's also the success login. I'm starting a new activity, and the fail login is showing the error on the text field. Okay, the activity will implement this contract, and also it will have an instance of the presenter. The presenter here, it's getting the view itself as a parameter. So that's why I'm sending this as a parameter for the presenter. And also I have override the onDestroy method because we are sending an activity. And the presenter will have a reference to that activity. So if we don't destroy that reference, eventually that will lead into a memory leak. That's why we have the onDestroy method overridden here. Also, as this example, it's the first approach. I'm not considering the configuration changes. But if we would like to take this into account, we will need to have a holder. Much like the view holder we use for the lists and the recycler view, we will use something like that for the presenter at our activity. And also we have the login button. I'm using Butterknife. How many of you work with Butterknife? Also a lot of people. If someone haven't heard of the library, it helps you to deal with the binding of the views and also the click events of also the views. So here I have this annotation on click with an ID and a method. And what this is doing, it's calling a method on the presenter. So this is the contract for the presenter. Also, it's to the bare minimum, only the onDestroy method that will prevent the memory leak, and the login method that receives an email and a password, the presenter will handle this and connect to the model for the actual login implementation. Random pug picture, just to make sure everyone is paying attention. Pugs are nice. Okay, we're on the presenter. The implementation of the presenter includes a reference to the view and to the model. I mentioned dependency injection because when we are implementing this with a DI framework, I think maybe the best framework for doing this is Dagger 2. These two fields will be dependencies and will be injected to the presenter. So we have here the view that we are getting through the constructor, and using also a constructor, we're getting an instance for the model, and to the model we're sending an instance of the presenter, but more important than that, we're sending a way for the model to communicate back with the presenter. We're going to implement that with a callback. Okay, the onDestroy method only changed view to null to avoid the memory leak. And this is what I was mentioned on the top of the screen over here. You can say that there's a login task listener. This is an interface that the model will get an instance of, and the presenter will implement to handle the communication. So at the main method of the model, the login, we will check that the view it's different from null, disable the inputs. This is what I mentioned, that the view it's passive because the showing the progress bar, and disable the inputs, it's done by the presenter. And eventually we will call a method on the model. This is the interface. It only have two methods, one for success and one for when there's an error. And these two methods are going to be implemented by the presenter. So when we have a success login, we're going to do the opposite of the login method. We're going to enable the inputs, hide the progress bar, and call the success login on the view. This method eventually calls a new activity through an intent. And with the error, we're going to also enable and hide the progress bar, but we're going to show the error on the view. The model got this one method for the actual login logic. I'm not sure if I have the mock here. No, I don't have it. But here is only an async task and a random number generator to check if it's an odd number, and if it is, it will show an error, and if it isn't, it will allow you to continue with the next screen. Okay, that's our first approach to the MVP. It may seem like a lot of files, a lot of classes to do something simple, but in the long term, this allows us to be more, to have more order, and to be able to scale our app. How many of you are familiar with Event Bus? Also, a lot of you. Our first approach included an interface, a callback for the communication from the model to the presenter. I usually rather use Event Bus for this. I'm gonna go with the specific with of the library a little bit fast because a lot of you already know the library. So we have an event. This is a login event, a code to handle whatever is happening with the event, one for error, another for success. So now the presenter needs to be registered with the event bus, and in the onDestroy method, we add that there's the opposite, an onRegister call for the presenter to won't be registered anymore. And we also need to implement another method on event main thread. This is using the event bus library from Green Robot. There are a couple of options. Maybe the other one that's really famous, it's Auto by Square. I really rather use this one, but there are a little couple of differences among the two. Okay, so what do we do in this event? We check if the view is different from null, and if it is, we enable inputs high progress just like before, and also check what's the code that the event includes. It might be success, it might be error, and in each case, we do a different thing. And in the model, we are now posting an event instead of calling one of the methods of the interface callback that we receive from the presenter. So that's MVP. In a nutshell, what we're trying to do is doing a separation of concerns, trying to encourage the single responsibility principle. Have you heard of solid principles? Raise your hands. Also, a lot of you. Well, the S from solid is single responsibility. We're trying to get each class to do only one thing, and that one thing must be executed in the best way possible. And well, MVP allows us to do that separation of concerns, allows us to introduce a little order, and in the long term, it allows us to scale, to maintain, to test, and all the characteristics that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. There's also clean architecture. The clean approach is a little bit more elaborated. It includes more layers. This is the basic chart from a blog post from Uncle Bob that where he explains the clean architecture. And when we translate this to Android, basically we are adding a couple of layers of abstraction. This is the same chart. So we're keeping the view and the presenter from MVP. But instead of having the model coupled with all the business logic, we add some more layers: interactor, repository, and data source. The data source, it's can be an API, could be a database, could be any source of data. The repository is an abstraction that allows us to access that data and should be transparent for the above layers. And the interactor only connects the part of the app that's only handling the UI, that in our case is the presenter and the view. And on the other side of this connection, it's the data. So with the clean approach, we decouple even more and have our business logic implemented on the interactor or in the repository, depending on how are we using the data and if we even need to use data. The important thing with this is that the repository is only a connector, connects UI with data regardless of source and rendering. And eventually, this can be really handy when you are changing either of those, the source of data or the rendering. The repository connects the data source. Well, we might have a couple of different data sources. We might have different approaches to get the data, and we can connect everything through a repository, and eventually the data source, it's a database or API. So now the other feature of the app, the content, it's implemented using this approach. So we used to have a presenter and a view that's still there, but instead of a model, we now have an interactor that represents one use case of this feature. And also, we have a repository. So if you check like in the middle, there are a couple of new classes. We have 3 different interactors. We are accessing a simple list. One is for numbers, one is for names, and one is for words, trying to show 3 different use cases for this. All 3 of these interactors are getting the data from the same repository that's over here. So eventually, we ended up with 3 different connections to the same rendering and the same data source. But in this way, we can check exactly what is happening with the app, with the feature, in this case, the content feature, and how we are getting this content. So the interactor, it's somewhat simple because it's only a connection. Here are the contracts, the interface for numbers and for words. It only includes one method. And here's the implementation. We have the repository. Here I'm using singleton to get the instance. And after that, I'm calling the method getNumbers on the repository. The words interactor looks exactly like that. In this example, might not represent a big difference, but eventually, when we're working on a real app with more features, it will show different use cases for the feature that we're working. So now the presenter is using an interactor instead of a model. If we have more business logic, it might be encapsulated in the interactor or in the repository. I like to work a lot with Firebase, but Firebase, how many of you are familiar with Firebase? Raise your hand, a couple of you. Firebase is a real-time database. As a real-time database, usually you don't query the database, but instead of that, get a subscription on a node and wait for a change on that node. So when I'm working with Firebase and also with the MVP plus clean approach, what I try to do is getting a helper that like encapsulates the business logic that's independent from the repository, and the repository connects to that class to do all the tasks that are needed. But eventually, if I want to change Firebase for another database or another way of handling data and login and all of that, it will be easier to implement because it's only one reference in the repository. Another random picture. That's a grumpy cat wearing a couple of wearables. I'm an early adopter, so sometimes I feel like that, wearing the glass. What was the name of this? The Fitbit and all these gadgets. Okay, so the repository, it's in this case where the logic is located. I only have an array. It's simple as that. I'm creating an event using event bus, feeding the data to the event, and eventually posting the event for the presenter to read from that. Something similar with the other method from words. And before talking about that, we might even consider here that if we want to decouple as much as it can be done, we should post an event from the repository to the interactor and another event from the interactor to the presenter. In that way, you can test separated both the repository, the interactor, and the presenter. By the way, for testing, I think besides JUnit, that's the basic Java framework, RoboElectric is a great way for doing unit testing when it involves something of the Android framework. How many of you are familiar with RoboElectric? Also, a lot of you. Okay, just to wrap things up, I want to mention a couple of interesting resources. This is Rosie, a framework from Karumi. They are doing a lot of interesting things. This library, what allows you is handling the architecture layer of the app, so you don't have to build all those classes by yourself. The only thing that stops me from saying that this is the best approach is that you are depending on a library for decoupling. So it's kind of weird, but still it's a nice approach when you don't want to do that all the heavy lifting by yourself. And I guess that's what libraries are for, to do the heavy lifting for us. So you might want to look into Rosie. Also, about a couple of weeks ago, Google released a repository in GitHub. It's called Android Architecture Blueprints. And it's quite interesting because it's the first time that Google acknowledged that architecture of the Android apps is important. And even though it's in beta, it shows like their approach to MVP, to Clean, to MVVM. By the way, the main difference between MVP and MVVM is that MVVM uses, it relies on data binding. So if you are into reactive programming, that's also a great approach. And a couple of useful links. There's the repo that I mentioned, the link to the original post from Uncle Bob, link to Rosie, the link to my repo for the simple MVP. And before opening to questions, I like to wrap a little bit. We are doing this. We're bothering with architecture because we want to build software that's reliable in the long term. We want to build software for other human beings. We want for other people to read our code. And eventually, this will have great effects on our software. It will be more maintainable. It will be more scalable. It will be testable. And I think that's why we are developing software. We want to create things. We want to improve the quality of living of others and of us. So I think even though it might look like an overcomplication, having the architecture approach in mind when developing an Android app, it will really pay dividends in the future. So thank you very much, and I'm here for questions.
Hi there. It was a very nice presentation. I really do like how you connected the solid principles into the architecture and the clean code and clean architecture, and how it relates to this Google document that was recently posted on the architecture blueprints.
Well, the Google document, it's more like a collection of repos. It's their approach. They're saying like, hey, we acknowledge that this is a concern in the Android community. We are trying to do something about it, and our approach is this. You can take it, you can contribute to it, you can ignore it, but we are not enforcing, we are just showing the way we think you should implement these architectural patterns in Android apps.
The best practices or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any questions?
Hello. For me, the main problem with MVP is that the view is small and well-defined. Presenter is also small and well-defined. And model is whole rest of the application. So do you think it's possible to use MVP in a big or at least middle application?
That's why I think the mix and match is the better approach. Because with clean, you get to divide the model, so it's not like a thing view, thing presenter, and fat model with a lot of code. There are several guides you can follow to find if the MVP is right or wrong for your project. But if you have a model with, I don't know, many methods or too many lines of code, you might consider a different approach. I think clean allows you to do something like this because you can do a better separation of concerns, having multiple repositories, multiple interactors, instead of everything just in the model layer. So I will suggest that the mix and match, both clean and MVP, will be the best approach.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you'll stick around and answer more questions. We have a small gift for you. Thank you for your talk. It was a great one.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.